Welcome to the Ugly Bug Podcast, a production of the Ugly Bug Fly Shop and Crazy Rainbow Fly Fishing.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today on the Ugly Bug Podcast. My name is Blake Jackson. Today we're going to be talking with Devin Burton. Devin's one of our standout guides here at the Ugly Bug and Crazy Rainbow, and we're going to discuss the Grey Reef stretch in particular here on the North Platte River. But before we jump into that, let's answer a listener question real quick. This question comes from Angie out of Salida, Colorado. She says, "Hey Blake, I'm pretty new to fly fishing, but I've fallen in love with the sport. I have a question about casting. No matter what I do, I seem to always get wind knots, even when there is no wind. This has been especially frustrating when I end up breaking off the few fish I do hook. Could you please explain what causes these knots?" So Angie, there's a few different things that can kind of cause it. One, if your tippet is too light, you can run into that issue. But let's assume, for the sake of the conversation, that you're kind of spot on with tippet. I would assume if you're nymphing, you're somewhere between 3, 4, or 5x fluorocarbon. But if dry fly fishing, you'd obviously use probably be on nylon or monofilament and about the same strength. But if you're nymph fishing in particular, or just in your cast, generally what's going to cause that knot is you throwing some sort of tailing loop. So meaning that your rod tip, as it travels on a path, you want your rod tip to travel as straight of a line as possible. So it sounds a little goofy when you think about a cast, because you often think of, you're almost like tracing a rainbow with the rod tip. But the smoother and flatter you can get your rod tip to travel, the less likely you are to get that sort of knot. The other thing that causes a tailing loop often is a sudden acceleration somewhere in the casting stroke. So a smooth, clean pickup and then like an abrupt stop on your back cast, and then the same thing, kind of smooth and clean on the forward cast. If you're somewhere in the middle of the casting motion and you give it a sudden impulse of momentum, that's going to change the wavelength of the fly line as it travels forward, and therefore you drastically increase your chances of a knot. So smooth, basics of a cast is just a movement to an abrupt stop on the forward or the back, and movement to an abrupt stop on the forward. So thank you for the question, and let's jump into our conversation with Devin about the Grey Reef here in Wyoming.
The Ugly Bug Podcast is proudly sponsored by Wyoming. Wyoming-rooted fly fishing apparel and accessories, challenging the traditional mold, designed by anglers for anglers.
What's up, Dev? How are you, man?
Good. About yourself?
You're doing all right. Doing all right. Let's dive into the Grey Reef and the stretch of the famous Grey Reef here. So, for those that don't know, the North Platte is the actual river that runs through the town of Casper here. The stretch from Grey Reef Reservoir, Alcova Reservoir downstream, really all the way to the town of Glen Rock is what people consider the Grey Reef. When you get into kind of local lingo, often we talk about Grey Reef as from the dam at Grey Reef Reservoir downstream to Government Bridge or close to it. And then we get into Trapper's Route and that sort of thing. But when you talk at a state level or, kind of a greater scope than that, when people refer to Grey Reef, they kind of refer to that like 45 miles of fishable water.
Right.
So I know you have some fondness for Grey Reef. Why is that? What do you find unique with it?
Biggest guided fish that I got out of there with a client. It was a 30-inch brown trout that was super hefty. Thing was eating on some baby cutthroats. I'm sure that had been stocked in there not long before.
Right.
The coolest part is that you told me a month prior you had seen that same fish probably chasing minnows and came up by your boat and flared as soon as it got by your boat.
It did. Yeah, it was kind of a shocker for me that day, and was stoked that you found it.
Yeah. You were like one of the first that I had called. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah. So beyond the chance for big fish, giant fish, what do you see that the reef is unique or special compared to some other, bodies of water?
You definitely get the numbers for sure. And I just think big fish are in numbers, to be honest with you. And that stretch, that getting stocked with as many little fish as it does, it produces big time for those big fish. Because I think at a certain point, it just turns into a predator and it needs to look for bigger feed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So let's kind of break down the reef. We'll start at the boat ramp itself or at the dam and kind of work our way down. So the boat ramp itself is, approximately 1/4 mile on the downstream side of the dam. So for the wade fishing angler or, someone that wants to drag their boat up, you can actually go upstream of the boat ramp slightly,
right,
and get some fishing in there. I assume you wade fish that from time to time.
Most definitely. Cross over to the other side at the island.
Yeah. And for those that are interested in that, there's both sides of the river. There's a cool island, there's a back channel, there's the confluence where it comes together.
Yeah.
Those rocks up there can be a little slippery at times just because it's got a little more current, so it's a little more round rock versus mud bottom.
Right, and you don't really have much either from kind of the point of where there used to be the red sign across the river where it turned into Marton on that river left down to the cable. Yeah. Is kind of just big, deep slack water for most of the year.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some cool structure in there that definitely holds quite a few fish.
Most definitely. Yeah, she's deep.
Yeah.
You never know what's going to be in there.
Right. Right. So if we move, we think of the dam, and then from the boat ramp hole, there's kind of a little pocket right out in front of it, and then the kind of legendary run right there off the boat ramp.
A lot of shelves in there.
Yeah, there is. Do you have a preference, like left or right side, or doesn't really matter because they're both great? Or
for the most part, it just doesn't really matter to me. Mm-hmm. It seems like a lot of people would rather back row the left side for most of the part because you've actually got the rock weir kind of coming out and you get a little bit of an eddy over there. So I always just jump to the side that seems to be less apt to being busy.
Right.
they're all the same thing from the other side. You're still going to get the same, but.
Yeah. Yeah, and that left side seems to be, for those of us in a boat, it often doesn't have quite as many wade fishermen in it just because it's so deep.
Right.
Where you would need to stand in order to cast out to the seam.
Correct. You'll get a rare one kind of once it gets into those cattails a little bit where it kind of pinches up, but rarely.
Yep. And do you have a name once you move downstream from that to kind of that flat piece of water before you hit the cable?
Not really, no. Yeah. I just call it first cable.
Yeah. And then you round the corner and
dive into junkyard.
Yeah, everyone calls it the junkyard. For those that don't know, there used to be an old house and a big steel building that was up there on the left-hand side. The gentleman had quite the junkyard for a number of years. That's all been cleaned up now, so at times we'll get some folks asking why it's called the junkyard hole, being there's no junkyard there anymore, right? It's all cleaned up, but it was for good reason way back when. So that's a great wade fishing spot, a great run from a boat. Right?
I even spent a lot of my youth. There used to not be very many people when I was a kid. I used to duck hunt that a lot. It was a very productive spot.
Yeah. And so depending on the time of year, for those of you that don't know, there's a cable there on the top, like Devin said, the first cable. And then when you roll down from the first run into the junkyard hole and down through the reds, you hit a second cable down there at the bottom, and that stretch of river is closed from cable to cable, really because the junkyard hole is one of the largest spawning spawning beds on the river.
Right.
So they close that for a month-long period in April to give those fish a break and secure the future resource sort of thing and let them have some success.
Most definitely. I think it definitely does play a big part in it for sure.
Yeah. So we round the corner from the junkyard hole. We drop into the reds. There's all kinds of little buckets and features in there depending on where water level's at and what's going on. But I assume you enjoy that run like most of us do.
Most definitely. I don't know if you quite go into the at the top end of it. I really love when you get into like the car. I love the car, the underwater car.
Yeah.
Always seem to find a cool little brown or cutthroat off the old car.
Do you know the story behind the car?
I don't.
Yeah.
I've had so many clients ask me, but I always assumed like parking lot and just that the car's there. Like I always just figured like a drunken Friday night, like we're going to go out, go do some fishing, go hang out at Grey Reef, something, go have a bonfire and cars in the river.
Yeah. I don't know what the true story is, but that's the one I've heard that I think is the most plausible is down there at the second cable. There's a road that goes to that cable point. And I had heard some kids in the dead of winter drove a car onto the ice.
Oh, wow.
And started driving it upstream, and then it fell through, and they bailed. And yeah, it's kind of a unique setting. And our local TU chapter, Wyoming Flycasters Group, many years ago looked at removing it, and actually, in consulting with the Game and Fish, they actually recommended we leave it because at this point it's been there 25 years, and whatever contaminants that were there are now gone. And we do more disruption and damage to the river bottom by trying to remove it than just leave it and allow it to become part of the system.
The coolest part is when I go over the top of that car, if you look in the back seat, you can see a toolbox with a handle. The hardest part is the time I had Cody drop me off on it, the current would just push, like the roof had so much moss and it was so slick, it just pushes you right off.
Only you would
to actually try and hold, because the front windshield's still in it and everything, so it's like you have nothing to grab onto to actually try and, like, there's probably something cool in there.
Probably.
Something old cool artifact or something, but.
Yeah, I assume there's something.
Get your hands on that thing. There's probably something cool in there.
I would get. I've always wondered like how many fish actually live.
It's a great piece of structure.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I would assume if you're a big fish, you want to take a easy break, right? You get down by the brake pedal and the gas pedal down there. There's probably a nice little alcove you can just hang out in.
Right.
Yeah.
Seems like every year I can get me a good little beginner brown for the year right off the front bumper of that thing.
So we moved downstream from the Reds and, the car hole, the drive-in, whatever people want to call it.
Yeah.
And you hit the second cable. So obviously the month of April, then it opens back up. And we drop into the PMD hole. Your thoughts on that one? It's kind of a slower, meandering sort of run, but
yeah, it's kind of a tough one. Like at low water for most of the time of year, like it's hard to slide over that shelf far right when it gets into the cattails tight enough because you want to be able to fish that shelf. So like half the time I'll come down the left bank, kind of pitch it into that trough there on the left. And then I'll get down to where I get slack water and then come back up and ideally be able to fish it if there's not a lot of traffic on the river, and then come in and fish that right side inside, throwing left over that little trough. And at that point, you don't get to run it down too terribly far. Like you've only got to where it starts to pinch up with that little peninsula on the left.
Mm-hmm.
Later in the year, I really like it as it gets into that corner. I actually hug it really tight and just fish that slow water down through that right-hand corner.
Yeah. Be really productive at times.
Yeah.
And then at other times it's a goose egg. There's nothing in it.
And then totally different scenario, a year where you actually get random year of us having good grasshoppers, like you get to just annihilate that left bank all the way down.
Right.
That's pretty obvious.
Yeah. And then we drop in, for years, the next run, everyone called it the outhouse hole.
Yeah.
Now it's kind of been renamed, and there's a little campground access down there called Pete's Draw. But a very legendary kind of run on the Grey Reef stretch. Your thoughts on that run? What you like about it? Or
I love that run. Regardless of water level, it's super long. You get a long, beautiful drift, and it's fairly deep.
Yeah.
So I don't think the fish spook in that as much. Like not every run that we have gets as deep as that run.
Yeah.
And typically when they're shallow and we're early in the year, I think it shuts them down. Where in that water, they just may go deeper. They'll still eat.
Yeah. So will you often adjust length or
I'll typically go a little deeper in there.
Yeah.
But sometimes I was deep on that corner up above at PMD too, just rolling that corner really slow.
Yeah. And then you drop down from outhouse hole, Pete's Draw area. You kind of hit a long, meandering, big corner. do you have a name for that? Do you call it frustration flats like most other people?
Yeah, for the most part, yeah.
Yeah. There's
Desolation flats, frustration flats.
There always seems to be a few token risers in there that are like impossible to catch.
Oh,
right?
yeah, especially once you get down to where that concrete sticks out on the left, too. You get lots of them messing around down in there.
Yeah. And then from there, you kind of drop down in and kind of another legendary run. It's had multiple names, but the most current, I guess, has been called the Teddy Bear. For those that used to be the dollar hole, the $5 hole, and it kind of kept climbing, and now it's called the Teddy Bear. Do you know the story behind that one? Why it's called the Teddy Bear?
I think Red had told me at one point in time that there was like a 4-foot stuffed teddy bear that had hung up on like one of those metal green fence posts. It's actually, that metal fence post is still laying inside on that corner, just outside the grass at the point. Yeah. And it had just hung up there for a couple of years, and then it seemed like a big water year. I think it just had pushed it down.
Yeah, exactly. It was like a carnival teddy bear, and we used to mess with people and like tell them to pray to the gods.
You could just barely see its ears apparently sticking out of the water.
Its ears, and then it like got its head mashed into the mud, so its big glass eyes were like pointing upwards. So if you rode over it just right, you could have people look over the boat, and it'd kind of freak them out, right? Yeah. This hot pink face staring up at them. So
right, I didn't know it was pink.
Yeah. And then you drop into, we kind of call it the top of the ranch, but right there where Grey Reef Ranch starts. A lot of people call it the toaster hole. There's multiple names, but that hole is really kind of easy for people to read in a sense. You can kind of see where the riffle's at and the little trough's at. It's not a giant run, but it can be very productive.
Right, and it doesn't take much water on that one, and you can really, like, you put a little bit more water in it, and it actually does have pockets like a toaster. Mm-hmm. You got a pocket on our boat ramp side, and then you got a pocket on what used to be Marton side, now the BLM side on the right there, where you can actually run it really tight on that right side, throwing left, and have a good little bucket right there.
Yeah. That kind of brings up an interesting topic for those that don't know, or those that are looking for some more info on the reef. The right-hand side of the river, what used to be the Marton Ranch, has now been purchased from the BLM. It's going to change the dynamics a little bit on the river with that being a piece of public.
Right.
We've obviously have fielded, if that's a word, but have had multiple questions at the shop about where those property boundaries are at. Obviously we ask people to be respectful and understand, private land ownership, whatever, but more than anything, like the assumption generally is that the border of public to private is always dead center of the river. And it's not really the case. As over time, the river's a constant changing thing, right? So it's shifted left, it's shifted right in spots. So the property boundary kind of ebbs and flows at times. And obviously, if you're an Onyx user or a map user, you can kind of figure it out.
Yeah, big help to have Onyx on there. Yeah.
But there are spots and locations that, the BLM owns 3/4 of the way across the river, and then other spots that, Grey Reef Ranch owns
3/4 of the way across,
yeah, or even all the way across in some of the other banks. So it's pretty well posted and cleaned up. If you pay attention, you can definitely see where you're at. But it's not always dead center of the river. It's just something for people to consider.
Right. We just kind of had that prior agreement because it made sense at that point in time with Marton, because it was like a 50-50 split. So it just made more sense, and it was easement and what was going on just to do that.
Yeah. And at this point, the BLM's got a little bit of it with some signage, but the signage will be improving going forward, so it gets a little easier to figure out where you're at. But as far as Grey Reef Ranch, it's pretty well marked at this point, so you kind of know where you're at. So what are your thoughts on how that, are you nervous about it? Are you okay with it? What do you think, how that's going to play out?
Only thing that makes me slightly nervous is just making sure that everybody does their part of the spawn beds. Like, looking back on it, like, obviously it did upset a lot of guides, but then it's like, well, then we also get to fish it on our days off too, or whenever we really want to. But we just have to do our part to make sure that, for the reason that cable to cable is closed, to let those fish do what they need to do to keep the fish that we have.
Yeah. Yeah, the spawning habitat's extremely important.
Right.
Maybe you can help some of our listeners and kind of describe like what you look for on a spawning bed to make sure you're not abusing it, or some kind of dead giveaways as to what is a spawning bed and what isn't.
Oftentimes you're going to see them, and it's going to be cleared out gravel, because when they get in there and work, they work the moss out. So those clear circle spots, those blonde patches that are circles, are typically where they're working on laying their eggs, and males are coming in and trying to inseminate the eggs.
Yeah.
But like the part that I like too is like there's not a lot of people come wintertime, so it's like it's great access for me also is in winter fishing, to where it really doesn't, I think, pose a hindrance unless it just becomes a rat race or coming to do spawn beds.
Yeah. Yeah.
If we do our part, it's going to be beneficial for all of us.
Yeah, totally. And secure that, this resource lasts for, generations versus having some issues.
And for some new people coming in too, just helping to try and provide that information.
Right. Yeah, I think the key there really is education, right? It's not
because some people are
illegal.
just a week in and they have no clue. They think they might be sight fishing to fish in April, and they have no clue,
right?
Unless somebody actually that has a clue lets them know.
Yeah, for sure.
And there's a way to go about that too, for sure.
Yeah. So as we move down from, I think if I'm remembering right, we were right at the toaster hole, and we're dropping into Rainbow Run.
Yep.
So nice, long, even run. You can kind of approach it from either side in a boat, or obviously from the right-hand side if you're wade fishing, although the middle of that run can get pretty deep, and it's kind of gooey, bentonite, mud bottom. It's not necessarily stuff you want to wade fish into.
And I think it's got some decent rock on our side, on that left side coming down through. I think it starts to get mucky as it gets over more river right toward them cattails.
Yeah.
But I absolutely love that run. You get a lot of a good run for about 2/3 of the way through it, and it's like your last third you kind of run into just a shallow flat. I mean, there still are fish there, but
right
at that point, that last third, I kind of just push into fence hole from that point.
Yeah. And the fence hole, for those that, have fished the river in the past, it's probably where you ate lunch. It's right around halfway through the float. Both sides of the river there are public. It's well marked with signs, so it's easy to know where you're at. But it's a great run as well that can be a lot of fun.
Most definitely.
Yeah. So we drop from the fence hole downward. We kind of hit an island section. Most of the river runs left and kind of drops through, what we all kind of call the pump hole.
Right. You rarely get to access that right channel unless we're really high water or we're kind of peaked out in a normal year.
Yeah. The pump hole, obviously, for good reason. There's a big irrigation pump on an arm that kind of comes out into the river there slightly.
And the channel is very obvious there. Like, it's another one that's just super easy to read.
Yeah.
If you get to be first ones through a lot of this stuff, you can run it all fairly tight, too, and it really produces, and then you can just slowly work your way out.
Yeah. So we round the corner from there. We drop into Russian Olive, Ledge Creek sort of area. There's a bunch of different names. When I was growing up, everyone called that Little New Zealand or 3 Islands or 5 Islands, right? But there's kind of little pockets depending on, water levels, current flow. But it's a kind of dynamite location.
Right. Yeah. Kind of right there where Ledge Creek's coming in. Yeah, yep. And you've got the fence pallet kind of right up along the Russian Olives there on the right side. That one's one that you can fish a lot of different ways based upon water levels. You get a little bit of water over that thing, and the next thing you know, you've got a decent trough coming out where Ledge Creek is, and then you've got a decent little shelf coming off the island.
Yeah.
At low water, it's fairly obvious where you're going to do it. You're going to hug right toward the shallow and throw left.
Yeah. And then dropping below that, we hit the power line. There's a power line that comes across the river. Everyone's called it power line hole for a number of years. That one's pretty easy to read as well.
Yeah.
You know where you should be.
Yeah. For the most part, it's like you have a trough on the right, and sometimes you can slide in left and hit the shelf if it's deep enough.
Yeah. And then moving down past our big first lunch hut there, you hit what most of us call the corner hole. I assume you call it that as well.
Kind of diving in. Yeah. Coming just in below the top lunch hut there. Yeah.
Yeah, so big shelf there, and then you kind of round the corner and hit legendary Wind Island area.
Yep. Caught some great fish out of there. That thing it's deep in spots.
Yeah.
Like she is deep, deep, deep.
Yeah. That one's
There's a lot of fish in that hole.
Yeah. That one's named Wind Island for good reason. It kind of opens up. It can be a little brutal at a crosswind at times to kind of get through that straightaway. So
typically mostly upstream, slightly into the right bank.
yeah. Yeah. So if you've rented a boat or you're rowing it on your own, that one can be kind of hard to hold a line at times. It blows you around a little bit.
Might see a white cap in there, yeah.
Yeah. And so moving downriver from there, we kind of hit the Beehive hole. That one obviously can be pretty productive. If the water levels are right, can be extremely shallow at times too, and not really a great run that holds a ton of fish, depending on what water levels are.
Right. Does have a good little shelf that kind of hugs that left bank on our side too, even at low water. Mm-hmm. It isn't very long lived at low water, but there is a beautiful little shelf there.
Yeah. And then there's a big straightaway that can get kind of spawny during the spawn season, and it's kind of just better to row through and avoid.
Yep.
But at times can be some fun dry fly fishing if conditions are right.
Yeah.
Good hopper fishing if we get hoppers.
Yeah, the hopper years that we've had, it's been awesome through there.
Yeah. And then drop into kind of another legendary run called the Beaver Hut. Another kind of somewhat easy to read seam, deeper kind of V-trough characteristics that can be super productive.
Yeah, and can be another one that can be ran a lot of different ways at higher water too. Makes it to where there's some different shelves going on in there and really broadens that pocket a little bit.
Yeah. And then round in the corner from the Beaver Hut, you hit a straightaway. It's got a few kind of rock weirs on the left-hand side.
Oh, yeah, most definitely.
For those that don't know, those weirs were man-made, put in to help reduce some erosion off of that left-hand bank and then protect the island that leads us into the duck blind hole.
And you can tell that those rock weirs really didn't pick up a ton of sediment from those big water years. And I think they really, that section of water is a pretty long flat too. And I think it gains a lot of water on our big water years. And I think that's where it gives them the spot to really stage up and do what they need to do. And I think it provides good spawn territory too.
Yeah. And it was very successful on keeping that island that is at the head of the duck blind as you drop into the duck blind hole.
Was it starting to wear away at the top of it?
It was, yeah. It was just eating away at it because it did kind of made it like a raceway, right? There was no current kicking back towards the center. It was all shooting left and just taking that island out. So a little help kind of help save that island. So
yeah, because without that island, it's just going to end up diving into that left bank further, and it would totally change everything.
Yeah,
that channel is already wanting to go left.
Yeah, big time. So you drop into the duck blind. For those that don't know, obviously now there's no duck blinds on it, but for years that was kind of one of the better duck blind locations on the river. We actually had 4 duck blinds on our side of the river alone in that 150-yard stretch. So kind of goes back to the junkyard hole that, the name doesn't really apply anymore, but the name is stuck because, that's how everyone knows it. But a great trough there, just a classic kind of Grey Reef sort of run, right? Long and meandering, but
I love how long it is.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously more water, you can run it down further, but even at a low water year, it still will take you a long ways, and it's a fairly straight line.
Right. And then drop through the duck blind, kind of hit another big, long straightaway. A lot of people refer to it as Psycho. Some people don't even have a name for it. They just cruise right on through it.
I never really have.
Yeah, and then just work their way down into the Braids, which, again, has been called Three Islands sometimes, but I think Braids is kind of stuck for everyone at this point. And I'll let you describe the Braids. It's a pretty unique feature on the reef.
Yeah, so what do we have? We got 1, 2, 3 islands?
Yep.
4 islands.
4
islands, yeah. And it obviously, at lower water, for the most part, everybody's pretty much you can only take one channel. But then as you branch around the back of those islands, it starts to hook to the right, and it broadens into a big shelf. And as you come over that big shelf, it all converges into a big seam right in front of our top lunch hut.
Yeah.
I don't think there is a wrong way to go over that thing. But obviously, if you want to get more fish out of it, you run it inside and keep working your way out.
Right.
But when it falls off, it is deep. Like, there are times prior to John owning it, where my dad used to go in there and do some wade fishing on it and had had access to it. And he'd throw a full sink streamer line through there. And he's like, I rarely would touch bottom after that shelf.
Yeah. Yeah, it gets really deep.
But he's like, I would find some giant fish in that big, dark, deep water.
Years ago, I thought I was going to like outsmart the system and really figure out what was down there, and bought this underwater contraption and sunk it down there trying to see what was one. Of course, the camera wasn't great, so it was really green and mossy and kind of a mess. But I ended up finding a lot of carp. There's a whole lot of carp down there deep.
Oh,
right?
I believe it.
It's hard to differentiate between some trout and some carp, but there were a lot of big fish down there deep. But it can be really tough to get to them because kind of the compounding currents that take place down there below that ramp, it gets a little gnarly.
Oh, yeah. And when that shelf falls off, so I've actually tied a 5-pound weight on some micro rope. And so right after the shelf, you're maybe getting like 4 feet, and then you go 3 feet, and then it's like 6 feet. You go 3 more feet, and I've dropped it, and I've gotten like 7 or 8, and then all of a sudden when it goes off that, all of a sudden I'm dropping it. When I'm starting to span it out, it's like 15 or 17 feet. Right. It's like, that is one heck of a shelf.
Yeah, there's a big drop in there for sure. And then you round the corner from that as we work our way below the braids, and it's changed names a little bit now, but you kind of get to the top of Richner's place, which a lot of people now are calling the dinosaur hole or whatever. There's
T-Rex.
Noticeable metal T-Rex
rod and reel and a fish.
Yeah, pretty cool.
Little kids love it.
Yeah, and that can be a really good run. It kind of has all the classic, has a little back eddy, has a shelf, has the ripple seam, so can be a lot of fun. And then you hit another big long straightaway, and we drops into another run.
Yeah, kind of top half of that, it's kind of middle troughed. Mm-hmm. And then kind of as you come through the bottom half, it's obvious you got steep bank on the right, so it wants to hug toward that steeper bank, and that left side kind of turns into a flat.
Yeah. And then you drop into what most of us refer to as the minnow bucket, but there's multiple names for that kind of fast water run there.
Yeah.
Kind of right down the center.
Yeah.
And then it takes you into the top end of Lusby. Most maps and published articles consider that false Lusby at the very top.
Yep.
And I'll let you discuss that one. It's a pretty cool run.
The kind of our big broad shelf into the toilet bowl. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So that's another one it reminds me in a way kind of the braids, like shelf all the way across the whole width of the river. So it's like, obviously you want more fish out of it. You're going to hit it inside and keep working your way out. There are fish all over that shelf. It's a fairly abrupt one too. Like, yeah, top end of that shelf, low water, you could dang near walk across the top of it knee deep, if that. But then when it falls off, like there's times I have run super heavy through there, and I bet it goes to 8 feet right off that shelf, 7-8 feet.
Yeah, it goes
and
quick.
And then just progressively keeps going more. Mm-hmm. And when it sucks in on that right side, it's just super deep. Like unless you're getting a fish up elevated or you're just monster deep for the most part, just running that left side in through.
Yeah, that right side's nearly impossible to get a drift through that suck hole.
So much sand and sediment too. Every year when I get down to that run, I always look to see on the bluff at the beginning of the year when I get in there like this time of year and start fishing it a bunch more, what section broke loose and fell down, and it's just all mucky, sandy.
Yeah. I was on it, I think it was, 11, 12 years ago now, but we were fishing the run in pretty high water, and one of Marton's cattle that was up there on the bluff was walking close to the edge, and a big cornice dropped off the mud, and that cow actually fell to its death. It fell off the cliff and landed on the riverbank. But, this it honestly kind of shocked everyone, and one of those makes you a little unnerving. And like the next time I come down, I'm like, I don't want to put my boat river right.
Right.
That cliff keeps collapsing. I don't want to be underneath it. But yeah, the thing fell a good, probably 85 feet and fell all the way down that big cliff wall. So kind of crazy there. But it seems like every year there's little chunks of it that keep moving, and it's had a little effect on the river, how it's pushed it off that bank at times. But
I've had a little bit kind of in our just below Rush and Olive, kind of in that channel left there. There was one day I think we had caught a fish, and I was just getting ready to net it, and we'd actually got pushed into the left bank, and I'm just pulling away from it, and a big old chunk of it had actually fallen off, hit the water, and ran like a partial wave into my boat to enough to where I actually had to pump it.
Yeah.
And it damn near blew up my oar when it hit the water.
I bet. A lot of people don't realize our soil structure around here isn't the most stable at times, right?
Lots of sand.
Lots of sand and lots of bentonite, and bentonite doesn't really absorb water well, and then when it's forced to, it gives away pretty quick once it really gets a big water event.
It really makes you kind of over the years notice that, obviously kind of the typical thing of any river. It's slowly filling in with sediment. Each run has just gotten a little bit shallower, and you notice like the sand and spots wave up a little bit more, like at that particular run there at top of Lusby, where river left underneath you, it almost just looks like sand dunes, like actually has waves to it and fine white sand. And
yeah. And for those that don't know, the North Platte, we kind of have an interesting thing here of a flushing flow. So basically a man-made simulated flood, right? They'll
10 days.
Open the gates and give it a good pulse of water, and that helps move sediment and debris downstream and keeps gravel clean, and in turn makes our spawn more productive. And it's really done kind of amazing things for this fishery over the course of time. But it is interesting how you see sediment deposits changing and moving, much like you would on any freestone fishery,
right,
for that very reason that you've got, this man-made flood.
Most definitely.
Yeah. And so from False Lusby, kind of the suck hole, you kind of drop around the corner and you're really at the Lusby straightaway.
Yep.
Which is a nice little run. But for most people that are floating, there's a boat ramp there at the end of that little straightaway, and you've kind of hit Lusby. So depending on flows, I'll let you talk a little bit about this, but depending on flows, most people would consider that a full day float trip.
Yeah, or 8.4 miles through that stretch.
And so at low water, that's more than enough water to, cover. You're not going to be able to cover it super quick. So it's approximately an 8-hour to 9-hour float, depending on how you go about it. But at high water, you've obviously sped up quite a bit. So
right.
So at high water, what would you guess? Normally that's a 5 to 6 hour float, Reef to Lusby at really high water.
Yeah, and then there's also the part of like define high water. Yeah. Like what's a number for you on what you think would be high water?
Here probably over 2,500 or 3,000.
Right,
yeah.
Right. And at that point, like once you even start getting into, let's say, getting close to like 4,000 maybe, like, we're peaked out like typically on an average year, I'd say getting close to 3 on an average year. You could start thinking about getting down to government.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And a few times we have had 7,000, 8,000 running down the system, then, Reef to Lusby is more like a half-day float instead of a full-day float.
Right,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
and
cool.
All those runs, it's just obviously, like you've told me since day one, the higher it gets, the more you push into the banks.
Yeah.
Fish just push in softer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Our fish aren't looking necessarily to be right up the middle.
No. So if we're to talk bugs real quickly, basic breakdown, what's your go-to or thoughts on how you would approach it bug-wise, depending on, that time of year?
Early, we're obviously super cold. We're gonna have midges. We're gonna have a lot of midges. You're always gonna have worms, rock worms, San Juan worms. Then starting to dive in a little bit more later in the year. Then as soon as we start to warm up, we'll start getting into blue wings. Warms up a little bit more. Obviously, PMDs. You on a good year, you might see some stoneflies starting to come in, kind of the end of June time frame, coming into July. Yellow sallies, and then obviously start jumping into caddis, running that bird's nest a lot. And as the year starts to go, we basically just start to revert the cycle. We start coming back into more blue wings as soon as we start getting colder mornings in September, October.
Yeah. And then basically back to midges again.
Yeah,
yeah.
And the midges can always just be a staple anytime in the morning, cold morning. I mean, first 2 hours, you could pretty much always have a midge on.
Yeah. Cool. Well, appreciate having you. Thanks for the breakdown, and I'm sure we'll do it again and kind of keep working our way down the river. So,
yeah.
Place any people can find you, social media stuff?
You can always just call the Ugly Bug. Ever want to get a hold of me or anything, or you could look me up on Instagram. It's just my name, Devin L. Burton.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks, Devin.
Yeah,
Appreciate
absolutely.
it.
Thank you for listening to the Ugly Bug Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you have questions or feedback, reach out to us via email at info@uglybugpodcast.com or leave a comment on our social networks.